And thank you everybody for being here. It's an honor to be with you today. And gosh, what a day and a month to be here. There's quite a bit going on around this topic, as many of us have seen. And I thought I was real clever with, making some final edits last night about midnight and sending them over to Nikki. And it turns out there's even more things that have changed in this landscape just in the last few hours since I've edited these slide decks. So this is something that is changing very quickly. And it's important to be able to be here and talk about this even during that process. And I'm Catherine Gardner, as Nikki said. My pronouns are they and them. I'm the medical director of the Gender Health Program at LA County Department of Health Services. Really fun job, and I hope that if anything, even though these are dreary times, that I can and we can all enjoy in sort of the wonderfulness that is being able to walk with people in their journey. I think it's a wonderful privilege. It's fun. It's also heartbreaking at times, and it can be very personal. So I'm excited for you all to sort of walk that with me today. In our program at LA County Department of Health Services, we've been up and running since 2021. However, care and access at LA County was available even before then. Our program solidified itself though in 2021, and we've been going strong since then. I'll go on to the next slide. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. And again, this is a very very much a landscape that's in flux right now. There's legal changes, political changes, social changes that are impacting access to services in different ways for transgender people. So with today, what I'm hoping to talk about in that context is to really frame this and make sure that we're grounded in our ACEs and PACEs as it relates specifically to gender and transgender people. And that gives us then the ability to look at these other things in those contexts, and actually is, I find, somewhat empowering in being able to understand what interventions we can do no matter what changes there are. So after reviewing our ACEs and PACEs, we're going to talk about what gender affirming care and gender affirming services actually means. And I'll give you some insight here that actually there is no one definition. We'll talk about that as we go. And we'll talk about some current laws and policies that drive gender affirming medical care. And then we'll end really looping all of that together in what does that mean where the rubber hits the road? So how do we affirm and support youth at times when access to medical services are threatened? And that's where we'll end, and we'll have hopefully enough time for a lot of questions. Alrighty, so I debated whether or not to include this slide. This is the ACEs LA talk. You all are very familiar with this, but just as a reminder, what are ACEs? So ACEs are adverse childhood events. They're a list of 10 traumatic childhood experiences, which when counted together predict predictors for well-being in adulthood or lack of well-being in adulthood. You get a numerical score, and this is anywhere from 0 to 10, and a score of 4 or more really conveys a meaningfully elevated risk for negative health outcomes, psychosocial outcomes in adulthood that include even early death. So I really like this pyramid over on the right side of the screen. It is from the ACEs website, so right from the source. But I think that really the context that it gives is this is really a base for continued development and existence then through adulthood, along with what come before that, including social contexts and then generational experiences. And with the next slide, this is, again, we're going to go quickly through this, but this is the survey. So this is how you calculate someone's ACE score. And these, you can see these 10 questions, and those are the questions that give us the score that someone receives. And again, a 4 or more is considered significant. And that is where intervention is a must. And so then here's where we actually take this and we look at how we can overlay what we know about ACEs into what we know in the data that we have around trans experiences. And actually, what's really neat, but also predictable, is that these two really match up. And one of the things that I like to do is to talk about this data and give it a frame, because there's a lot of misinformation out there that there's not very much data about trans folks. There's not very much data around gender affirming care. There's not much data around gender affirmation. And what I'd like to do, again, when remind folks with these slides, is we're not going to be talking about data in depth, but just remind people that actually that's not true. While we always want more data about everything, we have a lot of data that we know that gender affirmation is important, and we know that makes a meaningful difference. We're going to look at a 2019 study that was studying ACE scores in transgender people. So they just did surveys, and they didn't compare trans folks to a general population of cisgender people. What they did was they compared trans-identified people to cisgender people who identified as lesbian, gay, or bisexual, which is an interesting comparison. And that's also not to say that trans folks can't identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual as well. These two are separate identities. So it is an interesting comparison in both ways. That being said, what they found was that trans folks have phenomenally high ACE scores. So 60.7% of transgender respondents had a score of at least 4, which is, again, astronomical. That's a very high percentage. This was compared to what they studied was, what they found was that 48.1% of their lesbian, gay, bisexual peers, trans folks' peers, had ACE scores of 4 or more. Again, the 4 or more is a significant score. What's also really interesting about this is if you look at data about what ACE scores are in the general population in the United States, this is also a very different number, and it looks different, which we would expect, as we know that populations and communities will have various levels of ACE scores depending on the context, the social marginalization or discrimination that they experience. So this next data comes from the 2023 bulletin and the MMWR, which is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. For those of you who aren't in medicine, this sounds extremely dry, and generally it is until it gets really juicy. So if you're ever interested in reading something kind of exciting, sit on down with the MMWR, because there's something every year that's sort of just mind-blowing. So what was found, or what was published in this bulletin, was really the prevalence of a score of 4 or more in the general population in the U.S. by state. And what they found was that there's extreme variable. They found the variability, and variability between 11.9% on the lowest end to 22.7% on the higher end, which again is compared to this 60.7% that we're seeing in trans folks. So significant difference. I left anonymous which state is the 11.9%, which state is the 22.7%, and if we have time in the question and answer, let's go back. It was not what I expected. I'll just leave it at that, and you could all look it up too if you're interested. What we can also look at are then the mental health, social, and health outcomes of transgender people. And we can see that these are consistent with what we would predict for a population that has high ACE scores. So again, one of the things I'm trying to highlight is that we have data. We actually have had data for a long time. With this study, I'm looking at, we're talking about data from, it's published in 2016, but it was a 2015 study and survey of transgender people. So what was found was, again, expected outcomes from high ACE scores. This is survey of transgender adults. So they found that 29% were living in poverty. And as we do break that down in terms of race and ethnicity, we find, again, unexpectedly, that is significantly higher for transgender people of color. We found 15% unemployment rate, higher in trans folks of color. Again, this is compared to a 5% of the US population at that point. 20% without stable housing or homelessness, 20% that work in underground economies to survive, 40% had attempted suicide at one point in their life, 39% were reporting significant psychological distress within the previous month. And again, this is compared to the US general population and is much smaller, 5% in the US general population. Also, HIV infections, more prevalent, 1.4% were reporting being HIV positive. This is much higher in trans women and significantly higher in Black trans women, again, compared to 0.3% of the US population. So as we're looking at data and data that we know about trans population, that we can see, again, that this is consistent, this makes sense with our understanding and our framework around ACEs. So in summary, again, there's a greater percentage of transgender adults have high ACE scores compared to cisgender peers, and social mental health outcomes for transgender adults as a population are consistent with the expected consequences of these high ACE scores. So that's pretty dreary, and we will go on to the next slide, which provides maybe a little bit of some positive next steps. So, well, talking about ACEs, again, it's dreary, to say the least. But there are things that we know make a difference, and that those don't have to be the outcomes. This isn't destiny. There's PACEs, and again, I struggled with including this slide because I figured I'm coming to ACEs LA. These folks know what PACEs are. I don't need to include this, but I did anyway, so bear with me here. So PACEs, protective and compensatory events. These are 7 specifically identified positive childhood experiences. And what's really interesting in study done about PACEs and the data that we have about PACEs broadly for general populations, that there really is a quote unquote dose response in reducing the risk of depression, other adverse outcomes associated with particular ACE scores. And what that means is that having one PACE is a dose. And so having 2 PACEs actually provides a bigger effect. So that's what the dose response means. So the more PACEs, the more buffer that someone has in these negative outcomes. This, again, a really exciting piece of information to have because it offers potential for intervention. Alrighty, and so this is now what the PACEs are. So these are the 7. The first one is felt able to talk with family about feelings, felt their family stood by them during difficult times, enjoyed participating in community traditions, felt a sense of belonging in high school. This is not including those who attended high school or who were homeschooled. Felt supported by friends, had at least 2 non-parent adults who took genuine interest in them, and felt safe and protected by an adult in their home. So those are the 7 PACEs that we measure. Alrighty, so let's take a look at this with the lens of gender, and specifically thinking about trans folks. So when we think about PACEs in trans folks, I actually look to this study again, this study was done a long time ago in 2010, and I bring it up not because actually partially because when this came out, it was really exciting. It was actually groundbreaking research at the time. There was nothing else like it at the time, but that was 2010. That was 15 years ago. And so again, part of me bringing up this data is really to convey a sense of we have had this data for a long time. Data exists. Data continues to be generated, and there's things about gender affirmation that we have known to be true for a very long time. So this study was done by Caitlin Ryan, a family acceptance project at Cal State San Francisco. And Caitlin Ryan, again, was a sort of a pioneer in terms of pioneering research about LGBTQ plus youth. And she gave us a lot of our initial really concrete data. So one of the really interesting studies that was done was looking at resiliency, and it was called resiliency, not PACEs, but resiliency in LGBT plus youth. So it was noted that some youth had really significantly negative outcomes. Others did not. And so this study was done to really be able to identify what were the factors that made a difference in these youth's lives. This study asked 4 questions of their participants. So the 4 questions they asked, which let me know if these sound familiar to some of the PACEs statements? How often did any of your parents' caregivers talk openly about your identity? How often were your openly identified LGBT friends invited to join family activities? How often did any of your parents' caretakers bring you to an LGBTQ youth organization or event? And how often did any of your parents' caregivers appreciate your clothing, hairstyle, even though it may not have been typical? So these were the questions. These were the questions that they asked the youth, and they rated the answers as low acceptance, moderate acceptance, and high acceptance. And they found some really significant scores. This table is phenomenal, I find, and we don't have time to go through it line by line, but one of the things that I'm going to draw your attention to is at the very bottom, it lists suicide attempts in lifetime. And this is one of the things that just continued, that was, again, groundbreaking at the time. It was in some way considered proof, although anyway, proof that support was life-saving and affirmation was life-saving. So what they found was that suicide attempts for low acceptance, kids who experienced low acceptance by their family, was at 56.8%. So 56.8% had a suicide attempt who were reporting scores that were considered of low acceptance. That's compared to moderate acceptance. So this isn't even like the ideal. This is just sort of a little bit better. And there was a phenomenal difference. So 36.1%, and then high acceptance, 30.9. It's just a phenomenal difference. This is one of the big things that came from this study, and it was really quite remarkable, and was really our first data that we could really point to that was said, yes, this is important, and let's show you why. So it was exciting. So this is that study. So when we also look at slightly more recent studies, but again, I'm trying to show this over the course of time. We have a lot of data. There was a large 2016 study that really looked into family support and mental health outcomes for transgender youth. This study, you want to read it, look it up. It's a great study. It really, what the sort of the bottom line of it showed was that youth were no more likely to have symptoms of depression than their age-matched peers if they were supported by their families. The second thing it showed was that there was still some mildly elevated levels of anxiety compared to their age-matched cisgender peers for youth that were supported by their family, but again, different compared to those youth who did not have support. Okay, so these are PACEs. What we've talked about when we reframe them, again, they've been called resiliency when they've been done in research specifically about LGBTQ plus populations, but we can call them PACEs. These are PACEs. So family acceptance it would absolutely be considered a positive experience. So for PACEs, when established PACEs are reframed again with regards to gender, the data we have regarding these factors that predict resiliency in transgender people match. So this makes sense. This all makes sense. And again, we have the data to make it make sense. So my hope with this background in talking about ACEs and PACEs, specifically with regards to gender, is that then we have this base to talk about what is gender affirming care and how do ACEs and PACEs interlay with that. I gave you all a little bit of a preview about defining gender affirming care and services, and that it doesn't mean any one thing. It is it's an umbrella term, and it is used very broadly. If somebody uses it, the next question I usually ask is, "Oh, it's so fantastic for you. You know, you're seeking gender affirming care. For you, what does that mean?" Because it's truly different answer for everybody. These can mean very personal. So gender affirming care, some connection to gender affirming services it can be very personal. So this can be about supporting someone's hair, their hairstyle, their hair length, smell, like their deodorant, their clothing, shoes, nails. It can involve binding and tucking. We're not going to talk a lot about that right now, but in the question and answer, if you're unsure what those are, including packing, we can talk about it then. It can include using a different name, pronoun, just with someone with themselves. It can also encompass our social spheres. So gender affirmation can happen with being out in different settings. This could be at home, at school, with friends, in a medical or therapy, mental health therapy context. Some of those, all of those, only one of those. It could mean being around community. It could mean attending events. This is like starting to sound a little familiar when we were talking about PACEs. It could mean interpersonal connections with other trans-identified folks. This can also mean mental health and medical health care. So routine medical and mental health care where someone's name, pronouns, and experience with gender are embraced. So that doesn't have to mean necessarily hormones, but it could mean going into a space where someone feels very comfortable that they will be seen and treated for who they are. It can mean hormones, it can mean vocal training, it can mean surgeries for adults. The legal aspects of gender affirmation, there's legal name and gender marker change. This can happen on a driver's license, birth certificate, passport, bank, medical record, insurance company, work, pay stubs, so many other places as well. All of these things can be considered gender affirming interventions, care, services, support. Again, this is an umbrella term, and there's a lot that I haven't even listed here. I'm sure you all could come up with too, some additional ones. So with that, let's talk about my view from it, so my perspective, which is the medical perspective, and we'll talk a little bit about what medical services for youth look like at this point. Again, I thought I was really clever with like editing this last night around midnight, and it turns out that there's still changes that can happen in those hours. But even with that, this slide is true. So I'm referring to the decision from the Supreme Court today that came out early this morning that agreed that Tennessee had the right to ban gender affirming medical care for youth. That was an agreement with Tennessee and doesn't change anything about California law. So in California, there have been no changes to laws governing access to gender affirming medical care services. But certainly fear, worry, misinformation can impact access even when law and policy hasn't changed. And we are seeing that. I'm not going to go through this. I actually was really excited when I made this because I love all of these things. This is if anybody ever wants to read any of these letters, it's like the most drama you will have from like California state managed care services. It's amazing and really describes the various ways in which access to gender affirming services for people of all ages is part of California state law. We can always go back to this too if we have time, but I realized as I was going through this earlier this morning that if I do go through this in detail, it will eat up a lot of our time. So if we have time, we can go back later. But take a look at this if you're interested. This just sort of details California state law, which really started in 2013 and is continuing to be active and evolve over the years until really up till right now. Specifically about, this specifically refers and is about our foster youth. It is part of California state law in the Foster Youth Bill of Rights that California foster youth have a right to access gender affirming healthcare and behavioral health care. So again, this is part of California state law. So this is, what future access looks like. It's really quite challenging. There's direction that the federal government takes that is seeming that it's setting up a direct conflict with California state law. How that conflict will play out and is at this point unclear. And that's very challenging, particularly for those of us who, again, are seeing patients, clients, youth right in front of us and trying to figure out in this moment, what does that mean and how, or next week, what does that mean for this individual person? And this is where I'm hoping to go next with our talk. How do we provide gender affirming care through uncertainty, changing law, and new policy? It's tough. And with that, what I think is really important are the fundamentals that don't change, those fundamental layers and the base that we build this care, these services, these interventions off of, which again, centering this idea of ACEs and PACEs. And that's why I spent time going through those at the beginning, because these are things that don't change. These are things that we know, we have known for a long time, and they're things that people can't necessarily take away from us. So let's go on to the next slide. So I'm going back to this lovely umbrella. And what I wanted to talk about with this umbrella is that so many of these things are not things that we can legislate. They're not things that can be put into law. We can support ourselves, our communities, the youth that we work with in almost all of these things without having to be regulated by a law or policy. So, for example, we can support youth in hairstyles. We can support youth in smells, clothing, shoes, nails. We can support youth in this way. We can support youth in being out. We can support youth in building community and interpersonal connections. These are all phenomenally important, and that's not to take away from the importance of specific interventions for hormones, for example. That being said, it's also really important to know that we can intervene in many different ways, even when our access can be limited. What I'd like to do is revisit this PACES slide and actually change it. These are my words from the general PACES language to PACES through a gender lens. So I'm going to start with the first one, which is felt able to talk with their family about feelings. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. And I'm switching this to felt able to talk with their family about their gender and they were out at home. Not everybody is safe to be out at home and not everyone is safe to talk to their family about gender. This doesn't mean encouraging people to take risks and to do things that are not safe. This just means this is a protective factor for those who do have it. And in ways that we can set this up for success, that's a phenomenal opportunity. The second one, felt family stood by them during difficult times. Let's flip this one. So I'm taking a little bit of liberty with this one, and all of these are a little bit of finessing, but we can all kind of put our own words here. But I'm going to flip this to felt family help them access interventions for gender affirmation. And again, we can talk about medical interventions, but as we've seen in our slides, many things are considered gender affirming interventions, care services. Enjoy participating in community traditions, and we'll go to the next slide. Thanks. So this one is enjoy participating in community events. This could be like Pride, some type of LGBTQ trans community event. So then number 4 is felt a sense of belonging in school. And I'm going to change it to out, respected, and had trans community at school. The next one is felt supported by friends. And this will be out to and supported by friends, had trans friends. The number 6 is had at least 2 non-parent adults who took genuine interest in them. And I'm going to more or less keep that the same with number 6. We can go on to the next slide, but I'll say had at least 2 non-parent adults who genuinely support them. And then the last one is felt safe and protected by an adult at home. And I'm switching this over to felt an adult at home protected and advocated for them. And again, these aren't large changes. This is all data that we have, that we know in times where we don't feel sure about a lot, which absolutely is now. Making sure that we are very solid in our base, making sure that we understand where we can support, where we can jump in, and that we still can make a phenomenal difference. We know that support, we know that gender affirmation in many different ways does make a difference in outcomes. And that is important to continue to do and to sort of shout loudly from the mountains with. And I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. I know that there is a lot going on right now, and I'm happy to answer to the best of my ability.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you so much. I think on behalf of our audience and the ACELA team, I know that I personally also would like to extend my most sincere gratitude, both for taking the time to present to us here and for really for the good work and leading the charge and understanding kind of how ACEs mediate the health outcomes for a community that too often falls outside of, our areas of institutional concern. As good as we like to think that we're doing in California, and we kind of think of this as like a safe, almost like enclave from some of the more harsh treatments that we see across the country. I think the fact that this is a community that still gets overlooked, even in California, and for reasons that most of us, I think, would be, too ashamed to admit. I just really appreciate the work that you're doing. And, at this time, let's open up the floor to our esteemed audience for questions. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please raise your hand. Or, if you're feeling shy, just drop the inquiry into the chat. We had some pre-submitted questions, actually, and some of them were really hard hitting. So hopefully, hopefully this doesn't put you out here, but the so one that was asked by Neil at all of you, they were wondering, what would you offer to an angry, depressed adolescent with a history of significant past trauma? Like any nuggets of wisdom, I think they're looking for specifically. So the question basically is, do you have any wisdom or advice to offer to a provider who has in clinic someone who's angry, they're depressed, they're adolescent, they have a history of significant past trauma. How would you, within the context of gender affirming care, what would you personally offer for that patient in terms of hope?
Yeah,
Maybe, I don't know.
yeah. That's not an uncommon way that youth will come into services in general, whether it's gender affirming care or not. It's not in our context. We see that as again, it's not universal, but that's not uncommon. And it's for good reason. Usually, there's a really significant history of trauma that comes with it. There's also, interestingly, I think specifically, this is true of other communities, many different communities, I should say, but within trans community, there's also a sense of community held trauma and knowledge, particularly in a medical setting. So that's also something really important to remember, is even if the person themselves hasn't been on the direct receiving end of trauma in a medical setting, that is community held knowledge, and it's very much something that people experience. Um, there's no there's no there's no magic to that. It is, what I have found is that it is meeting someone where they are. When someone comes to me, what I'm wanting to do is talk about gender. Hey, we're in a specialty care appointment, right? That's my agenda. That's not always actually the right way, especially in this context. Someone's coming in angry, yeah, angry, escalated, elevated. That's actually not always the right thing. If somebody comes in that place, what I try to do, which is sometimes successful and sometimes not, is what's the priority for the person that day? Because my real priority is to build a relationship with that youth over time, because that's what I know will make the difference. It's not about that day. So we can scrap talking about gender. Sometimes talking about gender is really activating. This youth, again, sometimes it's really exciting. Like, oh my God, no one talk to me about this. Like, I have so many things to tell you.
Yeah.
They're great and it's so fun. And other ways of coming in can happen too, where someone's like, okay, I needed this appointment. I asked for this appointment, but like I can't talk about this. Like I can't. I just can't. They're holding it together, and opening that can of worms is too much. That doesn't mean that we should never go there. It sounds like that is a goal, but really, what my goal is, and I think for lots of us as providers, is, I guess it depends on the setting, but is that longitudinal relationship, and that is where you can really make meaningful intervention. That you can de-escalate in the moment, but and my goal for those appointments, again, where there is significant anger, rage, activation on every level, is to see that person again. And so I will make sure that that appointment happens in a way, goes fast or slow. I'm thinking about one appointment just 2 weeks ago, similar to this, where one of our youth ended up playing basketball. And that was what the appointment needed to be. And it was
Wow.
not a good scenario to start with. It ended fine. I think the youth wanted to come back, but this youth was not able to talk about gender without becoming even more activated.
Hmm.
And what is important and what I find one of the things that I really, there's lots of things I love about my job. So it sounds totally like, so somehow there's lots of things, but one of the things that I really love is this longitudinal relationship, because this is where I think you can earn trust slowly over time. You can build relationships slowly over time. You could be the one of those two, one of those two adults who take genuine interest in somebody and be part
They
of
could add to their pace,
around,
right?
be part of their pace.
Yeah.
And that happens over a long period of time. And so I guess I would see
Mhm.
this, if it's at all possible, as merely the start of a very long-term relationship, and that the
Mhm.
goal is that the youth comes back.
Okay. I think that's fantastic. I love the concept of meeting them where they are, but part of that really is, what is the priority for that individual that day, right then and there? And then that's a piece of the trust of the longitudinal relationship that you build with them over time. I think that's really, really powerful. Another question that we had was, so this could be a little heavy hitting. And maybe you addressed this somewhat in your presentation, but uh, Dr. McCoy Wilson and all of you would like to know what some of the legal considerations should be for DHS providers at this time, if there are any. What would you have to offer?
Yeah. So we are governed by California state law. We also um, follow current established standards of care. Those continue to be what we use to provide medical services. And that's what I would look to. So both the standards of care as well as California state law, that is what governs what we do, whether it's around gender affirming care or anything. Um, and that's what sort of guides us there.
Mhm.
Um, Specifically around gender affirming care in California, again, the law has not changed.
Mhm.
It hasn't at this point. And so in many ways, the expected standard of care has not changed in the how someone accesses care in California, based on California state law and in compliance with California state law for that matter, hasn't changed. Um, that's what I would look to. There's a tremendous, again, like sort of that slide said, that while law policy that directly impacts how we provide services and the work that we do in, in every domain hasn't changed,
Mhm.
that by all means, fear and misinformation can and do impact access. And I would
Mhm.
say is continuing to get updates from trusted sources is important, especially as stuff continues to play out.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand that within any state, ultimately, it's the state's responsibility to provide for the general welfare of the population, right? It's the
Mhm.
general welfare clause, I think, that
Mhm.
really allows states to kind of take the initiative into providing, the types of care that they want to provide for, or at least to promulgate the laws that will govern the types of care that healthcare providers will provide within the state. And again, California kind of you know, seems like a safe haven in some ways. But resting our laurels on California remaining as such, I think, is kind of where some of us get nervous, but I think that addresses that question well. I wanted to check to see if we had I don't see anyone in the Q&A right now with specific questions, so maybe we can do maybe one more of the pre-submitted questions here because
Sure.
we did
I
have
can
some
also go
some
back to one of my
interesting.
slides I zoomed through
Oh, is
fast.
there? Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
I
Is
would
there?
love to.
We
I
have
don't know if anyone else would love to
we
learn
have
what
15
bringing
minutes
you.
left, so if there was something you kind of skipped over that you wanted to address, please. Yeah.
Let's do the question first, and then if no one else has any questions.
Okay. Yeah.
Go on and
Okay.
on about California state law and policy.
So let's see. So we had another one from all of you. How, just very basic question, actually. How do we refer patients to your clinic? That's
Yeah,
an important question.
yeah, actually, that's really helpful. So, you refer to us through e-consult. So our program is accessible to via specialty referral from any, DHS primary care, honestly, like any provider who can access e-consult. And you just go down, scroll down the list. We're under transgender/gender management.
Okay. Right. Okay. Yeah. So, which slide did you want to hit? For your, what did we skip over earlier that you were excited to talk about? We've got, yeah, 14 minutes left.
I'm thinking about this stuff. I'm so glad we get to go back. So if we go back, it's there we go. That's it.
Oh boy.
Yeah. So welcome everybody. This is one would think this is very dry, but actually it's packed with drama. It's pretty amazing when you actually look through it. So again, if anyone is feeling like they actually want to interrupt this question, by all means go ahead, but I love this stuff, so I'm glad we have time for it. This is a run through of California law and policy, and again, I think one of the values of it is just that we're all reminded that this has been happening for a long time. And again, that none of this is anything new. This California law and policy has been in place for many years, actually, at this point. So looking back, we're going to go on back to 2013. So California is implementing the Affordable Care Act. They're in the way that California is starting to implement this. There's a prohibition of discrimination based on gender identity with regards to coverage of quote unquote transgender services. That's what's put into the way that California is implementing the Affordable Care Act. In 2013, not that long after this was implemented, California got word that like insurance companies, specifically Medi-Cal, wasn't really doing this. So they put out an all plans letter. But for those of you who aren't familiar with all plans letter, I wasn't until I started doing this work, and then I started paying a lot of attention to all plans letter. It's a policy memo, more or less, that is sent out by the California Department of Healthcare Services that governs and sets policy and requirements for Medi-Cal. So this is what sets California policy. And this is how they communicate with the public around what their policy is. And by public, I mean us, who don't work for DHCS, but also insurance, so managed Medi-Cal plans like LA Care, Health Net, Molina, all those are managed Medi-Cal plans. So this is how they communicate, and they communicate in strongly worded letter, like a strongly worded email is essentially how they communicate. And you kind of have to read between the lines. Once you start to read between the lines, it gets real juicy. So in 2013, not that long after they they first put out this requirement to cover quote unquote transgender services, they issued another reminder that says, just FYI, we, again, this is me editorializing and reading between lines, we heard, which this is true, that you weren't actually doing what we asked you to do. And so let me define what transgender services means, because you must cover this. And so they explicitly defined transgender services as hormonal care, labs, surgeries, psychotherapy. This was for all ages. So this is 2013. They're like, so in case you weren't sure what we meant by transgender services, this is what we meant. Cover it. Come 2016, they heard that health plans still were not really covering this stuff, and there were phenomenal issues with access to care. As someone who was doing this work in 2016, let me tell you, there were phenomenal issues with denials from Medi-Cal and managed care plans. So in 2016, there was another letter that said, just as a reminder, we said, as per our last email in 2013, transgender services are medically necessary and must be covered. And that memo, that all plans letter went out. Come 2020, they did the same thing. And they said, come on now, everybody. Um, this is medically necessary care. They defined what medically necessary care was, and
Hmm.
that they explicitly said that gender affirming surgeries are considered medically necessary. At this point, we
Wow.
were still getting denials because they were arguing around what terms meant. And so this was DHCS continuing to define terms that said, we are serious. We meant it when we said transgender services, and this is what we meant by it. Like, there's no loopholes here. Cover
Yeah.
these services. Um,
Okay.
that was the last all plans letter, and that was in 2020. Um, Everyone was feeling pretty nervous. Like I said, while there were no changes to California law or policy that came out, there's been a lot that's circulating around, particularly on the federal level, and it's just created a tremendous amount of anxiety, uncertainty, that little chaos squiggly that graphic that I showed, I felt like summed it up for
Yeah.
me. And so DHCS actually took a pretty phenomenal step on May 7th of this year. And they put out not an all plans letter, but a bulletin, which is also their way of communicating around California state policy, DHCS policy. And they said nothing has changed.
No updates. Okay.
Not do anything different. Um, this
Mm.
is California state law. These are our policies. Do not do anything different.
Wow.
And it was just, again, worded letter, and very clear. So California has made itself very clear over the years. It would be very hard to argue that there's ambiguity in what California means by its laws and policies around gender affirming medical
Hmm.
services. Again, this is challenging because it really does set us up for direct conflict then, potentially with federal law if it plays out the
Of
way
course.
that it may, but that's a potential down the road. But as of
Yeah.
now, this is what guides our care. This is what we must comply with, whether or not we want to or not. But this is what the health plans and health systems must comply with in terms of access for their to services for their patients.
Okay.
Hasn't changed.
Yeah. That's pretty incredible. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah, like you said, make it clear. Make it
yeah.
clear. So that's fantastic. Even if it's just a strongly worded letter, it's just so everybody understands. Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's probably all we have time for today. I just wanted to again thank you and thank our audience for attending. Just really quick as we scroll maddeningly to the last slide here. We have our next lunch and learn on the 16th of next month. So please mark your calendars, July 16th, 2025. Thank you again to Dr. Catherine Gardner, and please follow us on Instagram at AcesLA. Denise is dropping resources from the Trevor Project and Pride in the chat here, dropping them like crazy. Thank you so much, Denise, and thank you again to everyone for coming today, and thank you, Dr. Gardner, for your good work and for presenting.